One. Okay, so the recording is going. And once again, thank you for being here. This presentation is brought to you by Pasadena Village, and I am going to turn things over to Mr. Brian Beery.
Thanks very much, Nathan. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. And because Bill and I know quite a few of you, this should be intimate and it should be uh, a conversation. What I hope to have happen are some questions or some thoughts or feedback. I also feel as though this is going to bring to you some information that you weren't aware of before. This is going to be revealing, especially, well, actually, by a show of hands, those of you have your cameras on, how many of you have read Diary of a Contraband? Anybody in the audience? Okay, Stephen has. But for the rest of you, this is going to be really fascinating. It's a part of our history that is, it's one of those places that it's uncovered through Bill's family maintaining the historical records and then sharing them with all of us, and then some of the it's been really fascinating to watch some of the honors and recognition that it's received, particularly back east. Bill will talk about exactly where that is and how that's happened. Um,
What's
so
the name of it again?
it's Diary of a Contraband.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And it's Stanford University Press. Um, so it'll be easy for you to find on the internet. Um, what I also wanted to open up with is that today is the last day of Black History Month, and I want to recognize that as part of the reason um, for the Pasadena Village to have Bill speak today or during February was to honor and reflect on Black History Month. So I think I'd like everybody just to take a minute of what the value is of Black History Month, and maybe what you did this month, if anything else, to celebrate it. And then we're really going to dive into it today because of the history that Bill's going to share, and then also the legacy. Um, B, also thinking about some of the questions you might have or some observations or comments, but we'll do those toward the end. So what I like to do now is to tell you just a little bit about the book itself. And it's written by Bill's father, um, but it's a reflection on what's really fascinating is this diary. It's a diary of um, Bill's great great grandfather. Um, and there are only, so one of the key points is there are only 3 diaries like this that exist that have tracked the experience of someone who served in the United States Navy from 1862 to the end of the Civil War. And it talks about what it was like to be African American, Black in the Union Army, and then also some of the experiences that he had. Um, and so what's really great is to read. So Bill's going to go into all the details about the book, but what I wanted to share was a couple of the reviews. So as an example, Diary of a Contraband provides modern readers with vivid insight into the life and thought of a man who overcame the degradations of slavery, actively sought his own freedom, and fought to make it permanent, and in the end forged a new life as a full citizen. An unusual work. It is one of only 3 wartime diaries kept by Black sailors. And that's a quote from the Library Journal. And I wanted to read another one. Diary of a Contraband offers a fascinating picture of everyday life for sailors and civilians in the 1860s. It also provides tantalizing details of antebellum Wilmington that have seldom made their way into written history. So it's a Wilmington Star News. Um, Now, the last comments that I want to make are just about Bill. I've known Bill for many years, and I've really appreciated our relationship and our friendship. And also, along with some of the other people on the call, our partnership in raising awareness about discriminatory practices, inequalities, racism in our country, and has been a thought partner and a supporter to some of the work that I've done investigating this history locally. So I really am grateful for that partnership, because it's enabled me, along with, again, Marco and Stephen and some of the others, to be able to feel comfortable raising these issues, and then also to step into public education to help people to try to change how they think about people from other backgrounds, other cultures. And then the whole point is to fight racism, to end racism. And one other thought about that is we need this now more than ever with the current administration. And we're seeing not only on a daily basis, but on an hourly basis, our freedoms being eroded. Well, there was something that President Obama said when he was in office, and it related to the fact that if we're able to solve the racism problem in the United States, we will be able to solve so many other social justice issues, everything from housing inequity to healthcare inequity to education inequity. Once we really tackle seriously racism, many of these other issues are impacted positively. So just a word about Bill before I turn over the microphone to him. He's lived in Altadena since 1988, and I want to mention this, and Stephen as well, and I'm very sorry for your loss, and to anyone else on the call who has, but Bill lost his house in the Eaton fire.
Oh,
So he's juggling a lot right now, so it's wonderful that he's able to be here with us. And he's been extremely active in the Altadena civic engagement arena, and has worked on Ellis and Garrison Clark remembrance activities, has created learning tours in Altadena, especially for USC students, and then has been deeply involved in the Altadena Historical Society with Veronica Jones and some of the other members. For more and more in-depth background on Bill and some of his accomplishments, there was a recent article by Aaron Aubrey Kaplan on the African American rebuild, Altadena rebuild. And so Bill was a key interviewee for that article. And once I stop talking, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to that article, so that then you can, at your leisure, you can take a look at it. But it's really impressive. And I think Aaron Aubrey Kaplan did an outstanding job of capturing Bill's essence and his impact on our community. So Bill, thank you very much for being here today, and for continuing to tell this story, which needs to be heard over and over again wherever we can find audiences, and for helping and collaborating with me to try to end racism, not only nationally, but here locally. So take it away, Bill Gould.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you for everybody being here. I think I wanted to immediately sort of dive into, I had created a little sort of overview of the story, and then I wanted visually just kind of a little sort of snapshot of the story. I wanted to lead with that, and then I wanted to come back and kind of share in more depth some of the pieces. So I figured I would just jump straight to that video, and then go through sort of a PowerPoint and a couple of audio and visual pieces that I'll interject at some points in the presentation. But feel free to stop me and ask any questions as we go. Looking forward to having a great conversation. So this is a story about William Gould, who's my great-great-grandfather, as well as my great-great-grandmother, Cornelia Reed And so Cornelia Reed Gould. And so I wanted to kind of share a little bit about their story and hopefully get into a couple of things as it touches Altadena. So I'll start right now with this video, and hopefully you can hear this and this goes okay.
My father, William B. Gould III, goes up into the attic and finds the diary. Until that moment, in 1958, the diary was unknown. This diary is extremely rare. It is one of 3 diaries known in existence from the point of view of a slave who escaped slavery to make a new life for himself. William B. Gould is a very literate man, indeed an eloquent man. Of course, his eloquence is God-given.
William B. Gould was born into slavery in the year 1837. He grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, working as a slave on the Nixon family peanut plantation. As a young man, he fell in love with Cornelia Reed, another slave. Their bond was strong, but would later be challenged when Cornelia was purchased out of slavery, leaving William behind. For years, they wrote letters with the hope that they could someday be reunited. On the night of September 21st, 1862, at age 24, William and 7 other men take possession of a boat and embark on a dangerous escape down the Cape Fear River.
That evening, it is dark and rainy, and William and his fellow slaves know that they must travel quickly under the cover of darkness, taking turns at the oars, knowing that their only chance at freedom lies 28 nautical miles away at the Atlantic Ocean.
On the morning of September 22nd, the men, battered and weary, found themselves in the rough Atlantic swell, hoping for a miracle. Finally, with their sail held high, they are discovered.
The USS Cambridge was in the area, and the ship's log describes the sighting. The strange sail, southwest by south, picking up a boat with 8 contraband from Wilmington, and this marks their beginning with the United States Navy.
At the time, it was General Benjamin Butler who hit upon the idea of contraband. He declared, "No, we will not return the escaping slaves to their masters, but instead call them seized property, just as we would seize goods from the enemy." A diary passage from William B. Gould on October 3rd, 1862, describes the important moment.
All of us today shipped on board and took our oath of allegiance to Uncle Samuel.
Very little is known about the role of African Americans in the Navy, but African Americans display great skills as seafaring people, and as a result, the United States Navy accepts into service 17,000 African American sailors, almost 8,000 of them coming out of the Confederate States, just as William B. Gould came out of Wilmington.
This is the silent Black Exodus, perhaps even more important than the Underground Railroad itself. The African American involvement in the Navy really transforms the war effort and makes it a struggle for freedom. William refers to it in his diary as the holiest of all causes.
During the war, a sailor's life can be dangerous at times. Listen to the words of William B. Gould as his ship, the USS Cambridge, is fired upon by Fort Fisher off the coast of North Carolina.
Many of the shots were coming too close to be at all agreeable.
Besides the inherent risks of war, the sailor's life can also be lonely, oftentimes longing for family or loved ones.
Cornelia, why do you not write?
I think that it was hard for William to be away from Cornelia, and at the time, there was really only one option, and that was correspondence through the writing of letters, which was difficult when William was at sea for months at a time.
They exchanged at least 60 letters during the war. Throughout his life, William had many correspondents. One of the more notable was Abraham Galloway, an escaped slave who became a spy for the United States.
William met with Galloway in New York City, just a week after Galloway had met with President Lincoln to discuss suffrage, what North Carolina would look like after the war. It was William's mission to be active and passionate about the state of African Americans at the time. He published several articles in the Anglo-African, an important abolitionist newspaper.
The second ship that William B. Gould served on was the USS Niagara, one of the most formidable ships in the Union. The Niagara's main objective was tracking down enemy ships in various ports around the globe.
This turned out to be an incredible journey for William, who got to see the world and often wrote about his adventures in the diary. One time, they went to assist some Italian ships which were in peril in the Atlantic, and they ran into a terrible storm.
All last night, we went before the gale. The gale still blows fresh. It was worth something to be upon the deck. Although there is much danger in a storm, there's something very sublime in one. To hear the roar of the storm, the hissing of the waves, the whistling of the rigging, and the cannon-like report of the torn sail, and above all, the stern word of command and the shrill sound of the boatman's pipe. All night with eager eyes, both officers and men paced the deck, feeling unmeasured secure. Shine out, fair sun, and smoke the waves that we may protect on our course and all be saved.
On April 15, 1865, William B. Gould documented an important moment in history.
On my return on board, I heard the glad tidings that was the Stars and Stripes had been planted over the capital of the defeated Confederacy by the invincible Grant. While we honor the living soldiers who have done so much, we must not forget to whisper, for fear of disturbing the glorious sleep of the many who have fallen, martyrs to the cause of right and equality.
On September 29, 1865, the Niagara finally returns to the Charleston Naval Shipyard in Massachusetts, and William writes the very last page of his diary.
At 5 o'clock, I received my discharge, being 3 years and 9 days in the service of Uncle Sam, and glad I am to receive it. Paid $4.24. So ends my service in the Navy of the United States of America.
After the war, William traveled to Nantucket to finally be reunited with Cornelia Reed. 2 months later, on November 22, 1865, William and Cornelia married. They made a life for themselves in Dedham, Massachusetts, and had 8 children. 5 of the boys went on to serve in the United States military, just as their fathers so proudly did after he escaped from slavery.
William B. Gould's story is so important and needs to be told. It's a small step forward to recognizing the African American contribution to the war effort and to the country. It's affected a generation of people and will continue to be an important part of our country's history. I'll leave you with William B. Gould's powerful words.
The Negro and his friends. We will now begin by looking far into the past. beyond the Declaration of Independence in '76, to that memorable day, the 11th of December, 1614, when 11 Negro slaves landed at Jamestown, Virginia, and asked you, was it for any act of friendship that those benighted Africans were torn from their loved homes on the free plains of Africa's shores and transferred to the wilderness of America? Was it an act of friendship that those Dutch traders exposed the Negroes for sale? Was it an act of friendship that caused them to buy those misfortunate ones and make them the hewers of wood and the drawers of water to clear their land, to build their cities and feed their mouths? And from the doings of that eventful day sprang all the evils of slavery.
Let me just stop that. Okay. Yeah, so that just sort of starts us off. I want to sort of circle back to the story. It's sort of a Cliff Notes version of the story, and I want to kind of share a little bit more in depth about the story, and kind of get into some of those pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and start sort of a PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully, feel free to ask questions. So, um, so uh, William B. Gould, my dad wrote a book in 2002 entitled Diary of a Contraband, the Civil War Passage of a Black Sailor. And so happy to kind of share a little bit about his and Cornelia Reed's life today, and some of the relatives and contexts of both of them. Here's William pictured in the 1917, the NAACP had a photo in the Crisis magazine where William and his sons are pictured, and the caption was "The Goulds, a Fighting Family." So William is an older man at this point, but you could see all of his sons are decorated for various service in the military, ranging from the Spanish-American Civil War, Spanish-American War, to World War I. The story kind of starts with my grandfather to some degree. In 1958, William Gould's diary was in a great-great-uncle's attic, and that great-great-uncle died and bequeathed the property to my grandfather. So at that point, William Gould, my grandfather, William Gould III, became in possession of the diary. And so he and my father began discussions about, kind of what this was, and reading the diary. So it was sort of not known to, at least to my grandfather and my father before that point. So as William Gould is born to an enslaved woman. He was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he ultimately dies at the age of 85 in 1923. As was mentioned kind of in the video, this John Hope Franklin, a Black historian, kind of helped our family kind of on this inquiry, along with many other folks. And so many people have referred to this as the most significant African-American diary from someone who came out of enslavement and fought in the Civil War. So it covers from September 1862 all the way to 1865. So basically a 3-year period. There is 6 months where there are no entries, and there are a few entries, such as the one we just heard, where it's undated. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But as you can see, the diary has incredible penmanship, and sometimes they're long passages, sometimes they're short passages. But this is a diary that we donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society at least a decade ago, because it was sort of in in a state where we felt like a museum had to handle this particular document because it was starting to crumble a little bit, and we wanted to make sure it was in good hands. So um, I'm going to just pause and put something in the chat super quick and come right back to this. So this is Stanford University has digitized all of the diary. So you can go at the bottom of this link, you can go to September 27th, the very first day of his entries, 1862, and you could see in his own writing what William Gould was talking about that particular day. Or towards the latter part of the war, you can go to specific dates and look at what William Gould in his own penmanship was writing about in the diary. So I think that's a a great digital service that and hopefully I didn't screw up my PowerPoint here by
Bill, can we ask questions now?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
How did he, being a slave, how did he learn to write and read?
Well, we don't know exactly what that story is. We know that many Black folks were being taught. It first of all, it was a you could be punished by potentially death or significant for both teaching and or being taught in terms of in these times. And so, but we do know that churches were involved in some literacy movements. So we know that there were Methodists that were known to have been teaching Black folks how to read and write. We know one of the women that I worked on, in terms of who's buried in Altadena, Ellen Garrison Clark, that was something that she was doing. She was teaching Black folks how to read and write throughout the country. So I think I was quoted in the LA Times saying, I wonder if somebody like her was teaching my great either she or somebody like her was teaching my great grandparents how to read and write. And so so in any case, wanted to just sort of we don't know the exact story there in terms of how he learned to read and write. So to some degree he's self-taught. As you'll see, there are misspellings in his writings, but there is a certain eloquence of his writing tone, and he really has some incredible ways of capturing things that are going on in his world. And so we're really thankful, and partly his story is brought to life because of this 3-year document. We don't know a whole lot about his life before this diary begins, and so this diary is a tremendous aid to giving us a little picture into his life, and also some of his the folks that he connected with. So I'm gonna hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, really, that's amazing.
So I'm going to go back. Hopefully this is the right one. So yeah, so this is the passage, and you heard it, so I'm not going to have you. This is the really one of the undated passages. Is entitled "The Negro and His Friends and Foes," and I think what's interesting. This was the passage that he wrote that I think is particularly powerful. There are a lot of powerful things in the book, but in his diary, but he talks about, I'll just sort of, I won't read the whole thing, but I'll start it. We will now begin by looking far into the past, far beyond the Declaration of Independence of 76 to that memorable day, the 11th of December, 1614. I think he meant to say 1619, when 11 Negro slaves landed at Jamestown, Virginia. And so he goes on to sort of talk about the horrors of enslavement and kind of that whole process. But a large part of this story, even though that's a very important chapter, is sort of post enslavement and kind of the world that opens up to him after after his enslavement and his he's I want to touch on his wife, Cornelia Reed, who in her own right, we don't know as much about her because we don't have a 3-year diary, but what we do know is that she was purchased out of enslavement in 1858, I believe it is. And so she there was a man named here on the left named Reverend James Crawford. And so he was the pastor of a African Baptist church on Nantucket. And he was successfully able to organize a campaign to purchase Cornelia out of enslavement. He was married to Cornelia's sister, and so they knew she was up for sale, and they were able to purchase Cornelia and bring her to Nantucket. William and Cornelia obviously knew each other from Wilmington. She's originally from South Carolina, and it's kind of interesting in the diary. At one point, Cornelia, William is fighting Cornelia's the slave owner of Cornelia, the former slave owner, and he's in charge of this Confederate ship, and William's ship is fighting that ship. So kind of ironic, but so Cornelia is, the person that we know he corresponded with most, and ultimately post the Civil War, they ended up getting married and, raising a family in the Massachusetts area. So let me just go back to the escape. That was kind of described in the video, but in September 21st, 1862, William, and there were actually 2 boats, but William's boat has 8 men, and they're going down the Cape Fear River, 28 miles into the Atlantic Ocean. They end up coming out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're picked up by the U.S. Navy and ultimately sworn into service by the U.S. Navy. Kind of fascinating because there was an outbreak of yellow fever in Wilmington at the time. So, I think if those Navy folks had really known about that yellow fever, maybe they might not have enrolled those folks coming into the Atlantic. But it was an incredible opportunity for William and the 7 other men. And I think all total, there were 2 boats that went down the Cape Fear that night. And I think there were 22 men total that made it out into the Atlantic Ocean, going only at night so that they wouldn't be detected. And I think this was shown, we know that William Gould, he was enslaved, and the enslaver, at least at one point, we don't know all of his history, Nicholas Nixon, and you can see the ship's log here where William Gould, and I think it's like John Mackey is below him, and it lists the names of the folks who are giving oath to the U.S. Navy, and also who their former enslavers were. So this is the ship's log, the USS Cambridge. I think it was mentioned in the video that at first, early on, I think folks were turning escaped slaves back, enslaved folks back over to the south, and then the North decided to not do that. There were something like 17,000 men who came who were African American, who fought in the Civil War. And so the role of African Americans was great, in terms of, that Civil War. I think that's something that's often not focused on, the role of African Americans in the Civil War. And my great-great-grandfather and some of his colleagues and friends who escaped were part of that 17,000 men group. As they're coming out into the ocean, into the Atlantic, the North has this strategy called the Anaconda Plan. And basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to starve the South, block goods from being able to come in and out. And so they're trying to block, to sort of have a blockade. And so the Anaconda Plan was kind of something that the reason the Navy is sitting out there in the ocean is this is part of the Anaconda Plan, where they're trying to control what's coming in and out of places like Wilmington. Wilmington's a port city in North Carolina. So William, begins his life in the Navy. Serves on 2 ships, and I want to just mention a couple of his correspondence that he makes reference to. First, I want to touch on George Mapson. George Mapson was William B. Gould's nephew, and we have census records of him living with William Gould after the Civil War. But George himself fought in the Civil War and fought in an all-black troop called the 5th Cavalry. He was in the first graduating class of Howard Law School. As you could see a photo of that first graduating class of Howard Law School. Then George becomes the first Black lawyer in the state of North Carolina. He's elected in Wilmington. There's this sort of fascinating piece. I know Steve and I have talked about this recently, but Wilmington has this very fascinating history after 1862, where there was a lot of good things happening for Black folks, which ultimately erupted in 1898. And so many Black folks in Reconstruction were elected, and there were very high literacy rates in Wilmington. And so a lot of people will say it's very similar situation to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is really later in history, but Wilmington has a certain sort of good well-being, for, so to speak, for Black folks. Unfortunately, 1898, much of that eroded. And so Mapson is a person that's elected, and he and Gould are he and my great-great-grandfather are corresponding through letters. This is just a picture of his enrollment into the 5th Cavalry for George Mapson. Also, I wanted to just mention, it was mentioned Abraham Galloway. So William meets with Abraham Galloway. Abraham sometimes is maybe as famous in some respects as Nat Turner, just a little later in history. But he did a lot of organizing of Black folks and helping Black folks out of very difficult situations in enslavement. And so I wanted to just play a tiny clip. NPR did a great story on, and I'm going to also put it in the chat here. I'm just going to play like 2 minutes of it for you guys. It's NPR did a story a couple of years ago on Abraham Galloway, and I think he in his own right is kind of a fascinating individual. But this is somebody that William is meeting with and interacting with, and so I just wanted to quickly share his hopefully, and I missed my cue here, so let me try and I should have had this all queued up. I did have it all queued up, but I just don't know where I put it, so I'm just gonna quickly bring it back and then share it with you. Just 2 minutes of this. Let me go ahead and share this with you. So as I said, this is a story that NPR did on Abraham Galloway. I'm just going to play the first 2 minutes.
Sandbars.
Abraham Galloway has been compared.
So we'll go back to the beginning. Sorry. Hopefully it's going.
I think you turned off the sound.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about this, guys. Technical screwing it up.
So where your cursor is right now, that's the sound. If you could move it to the right.
Move it to, oh, turn it up.
Type of individual. And he comes strapped all the time.
That's
Sorry,
Still trying to change that.
Abraham Galloway was a man with swagger and style and a pistol in his belt.
He was a very attractive, very charismatic, fly type of individual. And he comes strapped all the time.
That's actor Mike Wiley and playwright Howard Kraft. They developed a one-man show about Galloway.
We refuse to be a slave to the southern white man, and we refuse to be only 3/5 free to the northern white man.
The Fire of Freedom is based on a book of the same name by historian David Ciesielski. Ciesielski says when he was doing research for another book about maritime slavery, he kept coming across the name Abraham Galloway.
And the stories were sort of so different than what I had been taught about slavery or the Civil War or the role of African Americans in the Civil War.
Galloway was born in a North Carolina fishing village on the Cape Fear River. Both he and his mother were enslaved. When he was 20, he escaped to Philadelphia and then Canada. He traveled to Haiti to join revolutionaries planning an attack on the American South. It never materialized. Ciesielski says by the time Galloway was back in the U.S., his reputation as a cunning, determined abolitionist was known to Union soldiers in the North. They were looking for African Americans they could recruit as spies.
They realize that they're about to send a lot of their young men into the South and they don't have the kind of intelligence gathering capacity that they want and need.
Galloway became one of the Union's most trusted spies.
I waged missions from the Chesapeake Bay down to the Mississippi River.
When the Union planned to invade the North Carolina coast, Galloway was the perfect insider to scout landings for ships.
Or else their ships would end up capsized or stuck on sandbars. So I reached out to the watermen and the boatmen of my youth, and word quickly spread.
Galloway may have...
Okay, so I'm gonna stop it there and encourage you to check out. I think it's 3 more minutes at your own leisure of kind of that story. But I just wanted to give you a sense of Abraham Galloway, one of the folks that that William was involved with, and somehow or another. I'm screwing up here. So again, as I said, he has a marker and kind of a very important figure, I think, in sort of the resistance movement, and did a lot of great things in terms of organizing Black folks and resisting some of these very evil forces. So William is meeting with Abraham. William also wrote for this abolitionist newspaper out of New York City called the Anglo-African. So he published articles in the Anglo-African abolitionist newspaper under the pen name of Olney. And so he one of the pieces he has is his own escape, but he also describes other. There's a number of pieces that he had in this abolitionist newspaper, and so he has one that's online that I'll leave before we. It's called An Interesting and Romantic Narrative, in which a woman that was enslaved, she reunites with her romantic partner, and they ultimately are able to escape enslavement together. And he writes about it in the Anglo-African. So kind of an important piece of kind of some of the work he was involved in. As it was stated, he was involved in he served on 2 USS, 2 ships, United States Navy ships, Cambridge and the Niagara. He the Navy was the only service branch that was open to black people at that time. The Army was not open to black folks. So I think later in history, I mean, all of the service branches have both had some positives and negatives for black folks, but the Navy, I think, in later times becomes one of the more problematic service branches for black folks. But early on in this period, it was the only service branch that was open to black folks. And as I said, he served on 2 different ships in his service. So at one point in the diary, they're searching for this famous Civil War ship called the Alabama Kearsarge, and this is a photo in the Philadelphia Museum of Art of the Kearsarge. And so this was the big target and he describes in the diary that that he learns of the capture and the sinking of the Alabama Kearsarge, and he's so happy. He says that, it was a deed that he wished that they had done themselves, but he was wonderfully pleased that the Alabama Kearsarge had been put out of business. This is a drawing of William B. Gould in his diary, where he's drawing some of these Confederate ships that they're chasing, and this is called an ironclad. So they have iron on the outside of the ship. Some of the ships that he was on, I think they were wooden, and these were some of these Confederate ships, these ironclads that were being built in Europe. So William ends up heading to Europe. He goes to Cadiz, he goes to Ireland. He also goes to Belem. He goes to the Belem Tower in Lisbon, and he and his ship are shot on from the Belem Tower. The Portuguese government is shooting at their ship, and so he is. They later issued an apology, but they are chasing Confederate ships back to their origins and where they had come out of, which is kind of a lesser known piece of the Civil War, that many of the Confederate ships were being built in Europe. So as was stated, William Gould, serves 3 years, and the service, and he refers to his service as being in service of Uncle Samuel, and he's paid $4.24 for his 3 years, and that ends in 1865. So this is a locker that we have in my parents' house of his locker, and some of his swords and some of his medals that he earned by virtue of serving in the U.S. military. I want to just go into a couple of things, backtrack in time. At the time of his enslavement, we know that William was working at this place called the Bellamy Mansion, and this is this very famous in Wilmington mansion, and there is a slave quarters there, and we know that William was a plasterer at this mansion before he escaped enslavement. And here you see on the left his initials that are carved into at some point there was a fire in this mansion, and in the 70s, and I think folks were not happy with some of the antebellum history, and so this mansion was lit on fire, and as a result, some of the signatures, including William B. Gould's signatures, was unearthed, and so we found his signatures. And at the time, the Bellamy Mansion contacted my father to say, hey, and they matched. This could be William B. Gould, and they matched the signature type with the diary. And over here on the right is the slave quarters for that Bellamy Mansion. So I just want to conclude with a few things. before, and then I'll open it up to questions. So this is William B. Gould and Cornelia and their 8 children. So they had 6 boys and 2 girls. The woman on the far right, her name is Medora Gould. She was the oldest child of all of them, and unfortunately, I had a diary of hers that I had received from my grandmother in my Altadena house, and that diary burned in the fire, 6 weeks ago. So I'm mourning that, and I should have done way more to capture that, so that some of her history has been lost in the fire in Altadena. But this is their family. This is William Gould and his sons, all decked out in a different photo, not the 1917 photo of in the Crisis magazine, but they're in their military garb. This is the 1917 NAACP Crisis magazine. And this is William kind of later years of his life. More recently, the Bellamy Mansion had there is now a historical marker in front of the Bellamy Mansion to commemorate William B. Gould's life. So they have this historical marker, and that came a few years ago. And we were lucky enough to be part of that ceremony. I will say that William Gould ultimately settles in Dedham, Massachusetts, which is right on the Boston border. So literally, he lived on a street that they were in the last house, and if you cross that street corner, you're in Boston. So he was really on the border of Boston and Dedham. But Dedham has now put together, they've named a park in the last few years after William Gould, and they put in 2 years ago they put in a sculpture of William Gould in the park, and this was while the sculpture was being created. And so you could see on the left the William B. Gould Park now in Dedham, Massachusetts. So I'll close last thing, and then I'll open it up for question. I want to touch on something that I find kind of interesting, and there's a lot of detective work in all of this. Right here on the second to the left from William is a man named Herbert Richardson Gould, and Herbert married a woman named Agnes Gould. So a Gould married a Gould, right? But Agnes was from Gouldtown, and as was my grandmother. My grandmother's maiden name was Feltz, and so so we were very curious about this relationship between the Goulds from Gouldtown and the Goulds from Massachusetts. So I also had a diary of the Goulds. I had a brief diary, probably like 10 pages, of the Goulds from Gouldtown visiting the Goulds in Massachusetts and kind of what they were serving for food, and how they greeted one another. And that burned, unfortunately, in the fire. But Ebony Magazine did a story on Gouldtown in 1952, and they called this the oldest Negro community in the country, tracing its history back to 250 years. And so this is the article in Ebony Magazine. Theophilus Gould Stewart was one of the founders of Gouldtown, and there's a theologian at Oberlin who has written a book about Theophilus, and it's called Elevating the Race. He is significant in Black religion. He ends up being a pastor to the Buffalo Soldiers in Cuba and elsewhere. And so he wrote a book here about the Haitian Revolution. And so we've been sort of curious about this Gouldtown connection. What is the significance? Because my grandmother comes from Gouldtown as well as Agnes Gould, and they're marrying the Goulds from Massachusetts. So clearly those families knew each other for folks to ultimately marry. But I found, and I'll conclude on this, caveus felts in my research of relatives. He was living in Altadena on 3160 Olive Street from 1967 to 71, and he was born in 1878 and died in 1972. So he lived in Altadena for 4 years. I went up to see how Olive Street was doing because I have another close friend that used to live on Olive Street, and unfortunately the house that he was in, as was just about every house on Olive Street, except for the very top one, they were all burned down. So, but caveus shows up in Altadena in the late 60s. And so I've been trying to work with the Altadena Historical Society to figure out, well, what brings him to Altadena and why is he here and what's he doing? But he's clearly, being born in 1878 and arriving in 1967, he's clearly an elderly man at that point. And so trying to figure out a little bit more about his story. So anyway, I'll just sort of conclude it there. We want to give thanks to John Hope Franklin for his role in helping. My dad brought him. He was a visiting professor at Stanford, and so he helped my father in the research around this book. And then also Beverly Tedderton was a researcher that's done a lot of great work on the Black community in Wilmington, and she was very helpful in some of the research around William Gould and kind of that region of the world. So I'll stop there and maybe answer any questions that you might have about kind of this story, and hopefully was able to share a little bit with you about kind of some of the these families and the stories and coming through to me currently, and my, I have a William B. Gould the sixth who's now on the scene. Some people ask, are you the final William B. Gould? And no, I have a son, 14-year-old son that plays on the Central Altadena baseball team, who's William B. Gould the sixth. So anyway, I'll stop there and answer any questions that you all might have about this story or any comments you might have. So thanks.
Well, Bill, maybe
Sorry for your loss.
what I would ask of the people in the audience is how is this story? What are your reactions to this story? What are your thoughts? How are you feeling right now? What is it about this story that connects with your either your history or your knowledge? What are you all thinking right now? I can call on people if you want. Don't be shy.
Well, it makes me very sad that Black history has been outlawed in so many places. This is very important because it's part of our country's history. And it's a very sad history, but it's important to know and learn.
Thank you for starting us off, Laura. Marco, I see you turned on your camera. Were you about to say something?
Yeah, so the breathtaking nature of this history, right, is there's a bunch of things flowing through my mind. First, this is information, this is history that is not part of the mainstream intellect, right? Mainstream educational process. And clearly it should be, right? It is a significant contribution to why we are all here. And ironically, how it led also to Altadena of all places, I think also underscores the rich and important, the rich history of Altadena and how how meaningful the African American community is in and how unique it is, right? And so, Brother Bill talking about the losses of the diaries and so forth. right, kind of underscores how fragile these stories are because they're not documented, because they're not part of mainstream intellect and conversation, and which is why it's so important that Bill and Steve and this project and Brian and really all of us, why it's so important for us to surface those stories and document and save those stories for the next generation. It's just that fragile. None of us knew, even anticipated what happened 6 weeks ago. And so the documentation and saving those and so I'm just, my breath is taken from Brother Bill's passion of expressing not just his amazing background and story, but a background and story that we all benefit from in light of what he's been going through. It's even that, I mean, so the message is that it's that important for him. I'm sorry for getting emotional, but it is, to me, it is that meaningful. So I just want to thank Brother Bill for sharing, taking time out of what he's going through right now, he and his family, to share with us something that is even more important, arguably, to society than what we even know. So thank you.
Thank you, Marco. And it's just to kind of tie things together, is that there's this fragility of history. You know, if we don't capture the actual documents, the documentation, and they're lost through tragedies like the fire, then it makes it much more difficult to educate not only our generation, but future generations. So the fact that this, it's so great that it's digitized, it's, you know, it's printed. There are many mechanisms now for it to be shared. So I think that's one point. The other one is this arc. So 1619 project is where we're speaking right now, right? I mean, Dick changed the name a little bit to 1619 something else, but originally it was called the 1619 project, and Bill, your great-great-grandfather, refers to 1619 when the first slaves were brought to this country, these shores. And so that arc of those hundreds and hundreds of years of slavery all the way up to today is just a fascinating arc, connecting even to Altadena and where Bill is living now. So I know Cheryl and Bonnie turned on their cameras, so I'm hoping that you had some observations or comments as well. Would either one of you like to share what you're thinking or how it's landing with you?
Well, I would like to say I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It's history that I don't know about. I was born in Texas, and so I don't know any of this. But the thing that amazed me is how much of your family history you know, because I don't know mine. I really don't. My parents were very lax in thinking it was important, and it is. So I envy you that. I'm sorry to get emotional too.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for sharing. Bonnie?
I want to just build on both what Marco said and what Cheryl said, and that is the amount of individual time, energy, and passion, and skill and knowledge that it has taken Bill's family to piece together the surround sound around the diary and the years since the diary ended is astonishing. And that, as Marco says, has come at the expense of the rest of their lives. I mean, because it's been a passion for all of them since this diary was found. And I think it's important to acknowledge the the fact that that's not supported in any way in our society, except through maybe family reunions. It makes me want to reactivate an old oral history project that I know, Brian, you were involved in years ago here in Pasadena, to just, as we become more aware again of the fragility of all of our stories, making sure that we're documenting as many as we can. And then kudos to Bill and to his dad, but mainly to Bill for picking this up and moving it forward.
Thank you, Bonnie. Those are wonderful observations.
I have a
I'll
question
just,
for Bill.
can I comment on one thing? I
Yeah.
think, often at one point we've had a couple of ceremonies, in the Boston area to kind of commemorate William B. Gould's life. But I think I was interviewed by the Boston Globe at one point, and I recall telling them that too often Black history lost, stolen, and strayed. So the idea of capturing and making sure it's part of the modern discourse, and proliferated. And somebody was telling me, we've been trying to work on maybe doing a documentary around this story or a movie. And somebody was saying, well, this is too similar to Robert Small's story. And I was like, no, we need to talk about Robert Small's story. That's a fabulous story, and that needs to be elevated. We need to talk about my great-great-grandfather and grandmother's story. We need to talk about so many other. It's not a one and done kind of scenario where we have one story that gets to represent all all of our history. I think we need to elevate as much as possible the different stories. And I think we are lucky, Cheryl, in that we have this diary, which is a godsend to have, because a lot of this history, if this diary doesn't exist, a lot of the history would be not available to us. And that's a roadmap for us to kind of figure out, kind of unearth some of this story. So that was a very lucky thing to have happen in our family. But I do think it's not a one person should not be, I've always marveled, like when there's a movie about John F.K., the Kennedy, there's like 6 or 7 takes on this guy's life, and I don't feel like Black folks should get one take on, a time period. I feel like there should be lots of different exploration, lots of different stories told. But we do, as a people, I think, all of us and our society, we need to do our best to help capture some of these hidden stories and elevate them so they're being told more clearly. And so, like, I don't want to be pitted against Robert Smalls, because I think Robert Smalls I'm all for him getting his due in society. But I don't like the idea of being pitted like it's either my story or Robert Small's story. I think that's a terrible macro picture. So, but anyway, I know somebody else was about to comment.
Yeah,
So
Laura, were you about to say something?
Yeah, did the Altadena Historical Society have any idea about this, or did they have any kind of explanation for the influx of Blacks moving to Altadena and what was behind that?
well, I think, you have the Great Migration going on, and Marco and Bonnie and Brian can also speak to this. I think, you have a lot of folks showing up in Pasadena and Altadena, families coming out of the South, over time, and greater numbers. I know that, a friend of mine moved to the Pasadena area, and one of she said the reason I moved there is because of double digits, because at the time there was double digit population in African Americans. So Black folks coming, and then more Black folks come, and at a point in time, I know the census was maybe 40 to 50% of the population in Altadena was African American. Today
Really?
today it's like closer to 18 18, 19%. But I know, when I used to work at First 5 LA, we did an analysis of zip codes, and I know Altadena was in the top 5 in the county for African American presence, in the county. So clearly a place where a number of Black folks have made history and settled, over the years, and lots of stories from, from Texas, from Georgia, from Mississippi, from all places throughout the country. Yes, it's Altadena history, but it's also history of our country, that's sort of filtering into, places like Pasadena and Altadena. And so, I definitely think that there was, jobs available, opportunities available in Altadena. There's lots of home ownership in Altadena there's been some studies. I think UCLA has said that 80% of Black folks in Altadena are homeowners. So a lot of wealth is tied to home ownership in Altadena, and there has been, kind of, similar. Unfortunately, some of these histories, whether it's Wilmington, Tulsa, Altadena, these histories of sort of maybe what we might call like Black Meccas or heading towards a Black Mecca. I think sometimes the forces of unraveling some of that Black prosperity are sinister, and we need to guard against things like Tulsa or Wilmington repeating themselves. In terms of some of the prosperity that places have, in Altadena, definitely, I'm hoping that the rebuild has we were able to preserve a lot of Black prosperity, so those are a couple of thoughts. But
Thanks,
I know
Bill. I think
Marco
Tylene wanted to, she hasn't spoken yet, so let's
okay.
go to
Sounds
Tylene.
good.
Okay. I thought the film was really well done. Really nice presentation, a lot of good information. And I was wondering if you've tried to contact something like PBS or even the Huntington Library to show it at either of those places, either on TV or at the Huntington. I mean, you don't answer now, but those are just a couple thoughts.
I haven't necessarily with the Huntington, and I know Tavis Smiley at one point did a story on sort of one of it for when he was with PBS. He did a little piece on sort of the William B. Gould story. So we've had a cross point with PBS and the Tavis Smiley show back, some years ago. But certainly I think, would love to continue to elevate, this story. But like I said, as many stories, I really, as I was working on the Ellen Garrison Clark story, I just love the fact that we're unearthing something that needs to be told, and that story is super important. And so many other stories, in Altadena, in Southern California, in LA, need to be told, in Pasadena for sure. Marco represents, he's four generations in his family in St. Barnabas. That's a really important story that needs to be elevated in our region. So I think it's really important that we connect to connect those stories and elevate them, as much as possible.
Yeah, and I guess I would say if anyone on the call has connections either with PBS or with the Huntington, please share them with Nathan, and then Nathan can get them to us. The Huntington would be a fantastic venue, fascinating, because they host historical presentations all the time. So that would be really, really worth pursuing. Bonnie, I saw that you unmuted. Maybe there was something you wanted another piece that you wanted to add.
Oh, I didn't want us to miss the importance of the restrictive covenants that were on the deeds of most of the property that was not in West Pasadena or West Altadena as contributing to the influx of African Americans in this area. It was, if they're going to come here, in, for a long time, it was the only part of the city that they could, or the community that they could live in.
Yeah, Ellen Garrison Clark, for example, she was buried at the Mountain View Cemetery. She couldn't be buried in a Pasadena cemetery at that time. That was the only cemetery that was open to Black folks at that time. So definitely there is that truth of, Altadena was more open in some ways. Still some problems in Altadena, no doubt, but I think definitely that's a great comment.
What about, was it the director that did the movie My Life as a Slave, or 12 Years as a Slave? Steve McQueen, I think his name is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he certainly seems very interested in this topic.
So I think, Bill, she's suggesting that you reach out to that director.
And I think I watched that movie and I was taken by it, but I think some folks, like I remember Snoop Dogg saying we don't need and not that Snoop Dogg is the arbiter of all of this, but he said, he was saying we don't need another movie about slavery. I think
I disagree.
I do believe that part of William B. Gould's story and Cornelius' story is that enslavement is a backdrop, but it's also about the experience post enslavement that is a critical sort of piece of that story. And while I appreciated that story, the 12 Years a Slave, and the guy who helped me edit the film, he was worked on that film. He was kind of I think he was did all the shorts for that film, so when they got an Oscar, he got an Oscar award. So anyway, this guy, his name is Gene Gamache. He helped me sort of cut that video that you were talking about. So he worked on that movie 12 Years a Slave. But I think I do think just like I said, we need way more stories about
these are about the
both
human
enslavement
spirit
and post enslavement and Reconstruction and periods in Pasadena's history and Altadena's history. We need to document these things as best as possible.
And
the stories are really about the human spirit too, and anybody and everybody can relate to that in some form.
Yeah, and to Bonnie's point, the issue of what she was describing as racial covenants, and those in tandem with redlining caused people to be restricted to where they were able to not only buy homes, but also to rent. And so only certain parts of the city were available to them. The other aspect of that historical arc is that Bill's talking about is Jim Crow. So after the Civil War and the implementation of Jim Crow, which forced people to try to look for a better life in California, and then ultimately found that Jim Crow followed them. So being able to track how discriminatory practices spread throughout the country. There's a book called West of Jim Crow that was written by a Muir High School graduate that describes the Brookside Plunge as one of the examples of the Jim Crow South showing up in Los Angeles. So that's why Bill's absolutely right. It's not just the history of slavery, but it's the history of what happened after the Civil War and the various mechanisms by which people were kept separate and generally unequal institutionally and structurally, not just socially.
And the resistance movement, like that's what attracts me about Abraham Galloway, kind of his story, the resistance movement to these awful structures, So.
Yeah, and Frederick Douglass is a good example of that too. Cheryl, I think you had your hand up next.
I just said, well, I'll do two things real quickly. One is that years ago, I said, we don't need another movie about the Holocaust. And then I realized not everybody's my age and these young people don't know it. So, and they will go see movies and they learn from that. So I think we need to have more movies about the Black history too. And secondly is, do you know a lot of history about your other grandfather, great grandfather, and your father? Do you know a lot of their history too?
Well, my my father is more of modern times.
Right.
He definitely he's a hunt and peck guy on the computer.
Yeah.
He's not really the technology is ahead of my father. But I think, but the bottom line is I think there were more mechanisms. A friend of mine who I was talking to, he did this documentary on this photographer in New York City. She was a nanny, and they uncovered all this, all her photographs and sort of painted a picture. But it's a different time, unfortunately. Like with William Gould, we have no pictures of him when he was young. We don't have any pictures of him when he was young. There's one photo that seems to have surfaced there of Cornelia Reed, which Henry Louis Gates had an exhibition on this past year in Connecticut, and she's in the she was one of the people, but on the back of the photo it says Cornelia Reed. So and it's something sort of that looks like Cornelia in her 20s. So we don't know the full authenticity of that document, but have to it would be weird to have something signed Cornelia Reed. It's not like somebody is out there trying to profit off that at this point in time. So I think that the available media today is much greater than some of these older time periods. But I do think it is important that we document. My dad has been a professor at Stanford University for 50 years now, so they just did like an oral history with him where they interviewed him, and some of his students and colleagues, and kind of sort of pieced together some of his story over those 50 years. So, but Stanford just did that in the last 2 years. My dad is fortunately still around to have that happen, but I think, I think it just says to us that we need to document stories as much as possible, in the near
Absolutely.
future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Vivian Mayer. It's this is Siskel, Siskel and Ebert. Their Siskel's nephew did this did the story on Vivian Mayer. But anyway, it was the final the piece is she had so many photographs to work from, whereas with William Gould and Cornelia Reed, we don't have a lot of photographs from that time. And I think it's just, as I experienced the fire, there were some things I was great about digitizing and some things I was terrible about. And but I think it's a call to digitize as much as possible moving forward, with history, and making sure that that's available to future generations.
So we're coming to the end of our time. Two quick questions. One is, Elizabeth, you haven't said anything. Is there anything that you'd like to share?
So much gratitude. I've learned so much, and I have a new stop to add to my Boston trip in a few weeks to go visit my daughters, and just really think the timeliness of learning about resistance movements and the courage and risk-taking that it takes to be in resistance. And that's really important for us today. And just all of the people who put so much energy with you, Bill, and your family, but also the historians and the all of the detective work that it takes to be able to bring these stories forward. I'm just so grateful. So thanks for the opportunity to learn together today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just one last question from my perspective, and that's for all of you. How, now that you know this information, how might it inform either your resistance work or your advocacy work? How will you use what you just learned today? So that'd be Laura, Bonnie, Elizabeth, Cheryl. I kind of know what Bill and Marco are going to do.
I don't know. I don't know how brave I am. Resisting even in quiet protests now, you feel threatened. And I know that's always been the case, but I just never experienced it so much. I mean, I was a child of the 60s and did a little protesting, but I just didn't feel threatened then. I guess maybe it was the youth. I don't know. But we've got to do something.
Thank you, Cheryl. Bonnie?
Well, my first response is that there's a lot I need to digitize, because when I evacuated, I did take one box of old letters from my parents and their parents, but I've got filing cabinets of stuff that's never been digitized, and Bill's, I'm so sorry you've lost those two diaries, but so just on a personal note, making sure that I've got everything that is truly irreplaceable in a form that can be easily transmitted. And that we've got to keep the resistance up. I don't know if I figured out some new way today, but it certainly underscores and gives impetus to this is not a one-shot deal. This is part of history. We're part of history. We'll try to have the same kind of courage that William B. Gould had.
That's wonderful, Bonnie. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I agree with that. And whenever I feel despair or despair, then I really tap into the stories of those who came before. And so this adds to my group of stories that I can draw on. And from an action perspective, I think education is part of our resistance. And so learning here today and then taking this story to my adult daughters who live in Boston, and to be able to go together and see the statue and to be able to talk about this story with other people might be something that I could do.
Wonderful. Bill, maybe give you the last word. Anything you'd like to leave us with before we go?
No, I mean, there are lots of lessons learned. I think every day. I'd never expected, some of my history to go out the window, just 6 weeks ago. So I think, there's always learning opportunities here to continue to learn and figure out new strategies around, expressing, stories, but also capturing and maintaining those stories. And I know even Steve, who hopped off, I think Steve and I were helping to capture some of the elders at St. Barnabas, and I know he lost some of that footage in the fire too. So but I think those kinds of things are really important to continue to capture stories and history. I think a lot of times people think, yes, this is 1862 and it is a fair amount of time ago, but it also isn't that, like here's this one relative of mine showing up in Altadena in the 1970s, and this guy's born in 1878, so it sort of connects, these time periods. And so, I think current history is important history, but so is, digging back and figuring out new ways to capture things, I think is important. So anyway, thank you all for sitting with me and being part of the conversation. Would love to continue it at some point with all of you in the future. So thanks for letting me be part of your day, and hopefully can cross paths again soon.
Yeah, we just want to thank the Pasadena Village for hosting or providing this space. And thanks to Bill for being willing to share the story and actually capturing it so effectively and eloquently. And I guess I would just leave all of you with the thought that, again, this is the last day of Black History Month. And I think we've just paid tribute or an honor to Bill's great-great-grandfather by talking about his legacy and his amazing story. So thank you all for being here. And the one request is, if you have anybody who you think Bill should be speaking to, And repeating this presentation, by all means, most of you know how to get in contact with me, or through Nathan you can. So thanks again for being here and for this powerful conversation. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, guys. And this recording will be added to our website and our YouTube channel as soon as possible. So keep an eye out for that. And otherwise, thank you, Bill. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.